The Battle of Staraya Russa, fought between 1941 and 1942, unfolded as one of the most brutal and strategically significant episodes of the early Eastern Front. Located southwest of Lake Ilmen, the region around Staraya Russa became a focal point where Germany's rapid advance into the Soviet Union met the limits of its own operational reach. The town itself, surrounded by marshlands, dense forests, and the sluggish Lovat River, occupied a critical position in the German Army Group North's rear. Control of this area determined the security of the main supply routes leading to Demansk and the approaches to Novgorod. The preconditions of the battle were rooted in the initial successes of Operation Barbarossa, launched on 22 June 1941. Within the first 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht advanced hundreds of kilometers, crushing Soviet border armies and seizing vast territories across Belarus, and the Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, drove deep into northwestern Russia with the objective of capturing Leningrad. By late July 1941, German spearheads had reached the shores of Lake Ilmen and the outskirts of Novgorod, threatening to encircle the Soviet forces defending the approaches to the ancient city. To the southwest of this axis lay Staraya Russa, a small but strategically vital town that served as a hub of roads and railways connecting Leningrad, Velikiye Luki, and the Valdai Hills. For the Germans, holding Staraya Russa meant securing the southern flank of their drive on Leningrad and maintaining logistical routes for the 16th Army and the 10th Corps. For the Soviets, the area represented both a defensive anchor and a potential base for counteroffensives to disrupt the German rear. The terrain, swampy lowlands interlaced with rivers, was poorly suited for mechanized warfare, but its control determined whether the northern and central fronts could maintain contact. The Soviet situation by mid-1941 was dire. The Northwestern Front, under Marshal Kliment Voroshilov and later General Fyodor Kuznetsov, had suffered devastating losses in the border battles and was struggling to stabilize the line after the fall of Pskov and Ostrov. The Red Army's 11th and 34th Armies, composed of reserve and newly formed rifle divisions, were tasked with halting the German advance toward Lake Ilmen and preventing a breakthrough to Leningrad from the south. However, their formations were understrength and poorly equipped. Many units lacked transport, heavy artillery, and communications, relying on civilian vehicles. The rapid pace of the offensive had carried their armored and motorized units far ahead of their logistical base. The 16th Army under General Ernst Busch extended its front hundreds of kilometers into the Soviet interior, while its supply columns struggled to traverse poor roads that turned to mud under summer rains. Fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and exhaustion slowed the German advance by late August. The town of Staraya Russa, captured on 9 August 1941 by elements of the 290th Infantry Division, became a key strongpoint anchoring their southern flank. Yet this success exposed the vulnerability of the German line. It depended on narrow, poorly maintained roads through marshland, easily cut by Soviet counterattacks. In Moscow, the Soviet High Command, Stavka, recognized this vulnerability and sought to exploit it. By late August, Joseph Stalin ordered a counteroffensive to relieve pressure on Leningrad and regain lost ground. The Northwestern Front was reinforced with the 34th Army, commanded by General Kuzma Kachanov, and the 11th Army under General Vasily Morozov. Their combined strength exceeded 150,000 men, supported by over 200 tanks and 600 artillery pieces. The goal was ambitious: strike from the east and southeast towards Staraya Russa, encircle the German forces holding the town, and restore a continuous defensive line between the Valdai Hills and Lake Ilmen. German intelligence underestimated Soviet capabilities, assuming that the Red Army in this sector had been decisively weakened. In reality, new Soviet formations, though inexperienced, were arriving daily. The Red Army also enjoyed the advantage of operating closer to its supply bases around Demansk and the Valdai Hills, whereas the German lines of communication stretched hundreds of kilometers westward to the Daug. The region south of Lake Ilmen was a landscape of vast peat bogs, shallow lakes, and meandering rivers that rendered movement of heavy vehicles nearly impossible. Roads were narrow and often built atop embankments, turning into channels of mud whenever it rained. For the German panzer divisions, these conditions would soon prove disastrous. For Soviet infantry, they offered both obstacles and opportunities for infiltration. By September 1941, the stage was set. The Germans sought to consolidate their overextended front while pressing toward Leningrad, unaware that a major Soviet counteroffensive was about to strike their southern flank. The swamps of Staraya Russa, initially seen as a mere geographic inconvenience, would soon become the graveyard of armored divisions and the scene of one of the East. The combined Soviet strength exceeded 150,000 men, organized into rifle divisions supported by independent tank battalions equipped with T-26 and KV-1 tanks. Air support came from the 1st Mixed Air Division, which carried out reconnaissance and limited bombing missions against German rear positions. On the German side, the defense was initially thin. The town of Staraya Russa was held by the 290th Infantry Division, supported by elements of the 30th Infantry Division and rear area troops. Further west, the 8th Panzer Division and 3rd Motorized Infantry Division were positioned to cover supply routes leading to DNO and Demansk. General Ernst Busch, commanding the German 16th Army, understood the vulnerability of his stretched front, but had no reserves to spare, as most mobile units were engaged farther north in the drive toward Leningrad. His orders were to hold Staraya Russa at all costs. The Soviet assault began with heavy artillery bombardments along the Lovet River, followed by infantry advances through forested and swampy terrain. In the first days, Soviet troops achieved several breakthroughs, overrunning German outposts and seizing small settlements east of Staraya Russa. The terrain, however, quickly undermined the offensive. Roads disintegrated under the weight of vehicles, forcing tanks to advance on narrow tracks or through peat bogs where many became stuck. German defenders, utilizing elevated ground and pre-sighted artillery, inflicted severe losses on attacking units. Despite these difficulties, Soviet progress was significant in the first week. By 18th August, elements of the 34th Army had advanced within 15 kilometers of Staraya Russa, threatening to cut off German supply lines. The 11th Army's left flank reached the outskirts of Demansk, creating a dangerous salient in the German rear. Kachanov pressed forward despite mounting casualties, convinced that his troops were on the verge of a decisive breakthrough. Morozov's 11th Army, however, was overextended and suffering from ammunition shortages. German commanders exploited this by launching limited counterattacks on exposed Soviet flanks. The 8th Panzer Division, supported by the 3rd Motorized Infantry, recaptured several villages and disrupted Soviet supply routes. Still, they could not restore full control of the situation. By early September, both armies were locked in a grueling battle of attrition. The Soviets had achieved tactical penetrations but failed to encircle Staraya Russa. The Germans had stabilized their defense, but at enormous cost in manpower and equipment. The opening phase of the battle demonstrated the contrast between Soviet determination and German operational rigidity. Both sides now faced the same reality. The swampy lowlands of Staraya Russa had become a deadly quagmire where mobility, firepower, and morale all steadily sank. The campaign was far from over, but already it was clear that neither side would emerge unscathed. The strategic goals and planning behind the Battle of Staraya Russa reflected the competing priorities of two exhausted armies fighting for control of a logistical bottleneck in one of the most difficult terrains on the Eastern Front. By September 1941, both the German 16th Army and the Soviet Northwestern Front recognized that the battle around the town had evolved beyond its initial tactical purpose. What began as a local Soviet counteroffensive to relieve pressure on Leningrad and secure the approaches to Lake Ilmen had turned into a struggle over control of supply lines, communication hubs, and regional dominance in northwestern Russia. Yet supply lines were dangerously overstretched. Roads leading from Dino and Porkov towards Staraya Russa were little more than dirt tracks, incapable of supporting the volume of traffic required for a mechanized army. Heavy rains in late August and early September transformed them into deep mud. Trucks carrying ammunition and fuel became immobilized, and supplies had to be transported by horse-drawn wagons. In some units, soldiers manually carried shells and fuel cans for kilometers through swamp and forest. Soviet planning during this period demonstrated a mixture of improvisation and growing operational sophistication. Stavka viewed the Staraya Russa sector as critical for regaining the strategic initiative in the north. The 34th and 11th Armies were ordered not only to recapture the town, but to destroy the German 10th Corps entirely, cutting off its retreat toward Dino and severing the 16th Army's line of communication. Communications were unreliable due to primitive field radio networks and constant movement of headquarters. Orders were often delayed or misunderstood, and poor mapping of the swampy terrain led to disoriented units becoming isolated. The German response was shaped by pragmatism rather than grand design. Bush's immediate goal was to hold the Staraya Russa bridgehead at all costs while preventing a Soviet breakthrough toward Demansk. The 8th Panzer Division, commanded by General Brandenberger, became the key mobile reserve, shuttled between threatened sectors to counter Soviet penetrations. Artillery concentrations were formed to provide defensive firepower, while infantry divisions dug in on higher ground, constructing makeshift bunkers of timber and earth. The Luftwaffe's limited air assets in the region, mainly reconnaissance and Stuka dive bombers, provided crucial but intermittent support, hampered by poor weather and inadequate airfields. Miscalculations were made on both sides. German intelligence initially assessed the Soviet attacks as local counterblows incapable of sustained momentum, failing to recognize the full scale of the offensive until late August. By the time reinforcements were ordered northward, Soviet troops had already advanced dangerously close to the Staraya Russa supply lines. Conversely, Soviet commanders underestimated the strength and cohesion of German defensive positions. The marshy terrain neutralized the Red Army's advantage in armor, as tanks frequently bogged down or broke through weak bridges. Infantry often advanced without artillery support, resulting in heavy losses when they encountered prepared machine gun nests. Propaganda framed the campaign in grand terms for both sides. German broadcasts depicted the battle as evidence of Wehrmacht superiority even in inhospitable Russian terrain, while Soviet media described the 34th Army's tank brigades had suffered severe attrition, with many vehicles immobilized by mechanical breakdowns or destroyed in failed assaults. The German 8th Panzer Division, though battered, managed to regain key positions along the Lovat and Polist rivers, preventing encirclement. Both sides now faced the reality that the campaign was evolving into a drawn-out struggle for survival rather than maneuver. Strategically, the Battle of Staraya Russa was transforming from a bold counteroffensive into a grinding test of endurance. The initial Soviet plan to envelop the German 16th Army had failed to achieve its decisive objectives, while the Germans, though holding their ground, found themselves trapped in a region where every gain came at disproportionate cost. The Soviet 34th and 11th Armies renewed their offensive on 16th and September, launching coordinated attacks from the Valdai region and from the direction of Demansk. Their objective was to converge west of Staraya Russa and cut off all German routes of withdrawal. The 34th Army committed the 245th, 254th, and 262nd Rifle Divisions, supported by the 25th Cavalry Division and remnants of the 202nd Mechanized Division. On the southern flank, the 11th Army attacked with the 180th and 202nd Rifle Divisions. Together they numbered nearly 120,000 men, backed by around 200 operational tanks and over 600 artillery pieces. Opposing them, the German 16th Army fielded roughly 60,000 troops in the sector, including the 30th, 290th, and 126th Infantry Divisions, as well as the 8th Panzer Division acting. The German command under General Busch aimed to maintain the integrity of their front by holding high ground along the Lovat and Polist rivers and preventing a Soviet breakthrough toward Dino, where the main supply depot was located. The Soviet offensive began with intense artillery preparation that lasted for several hours, followed by frontal infantry assaults through the swampy forests. Initial progress appeared promising. The 254th Rifle Division captured the villages of Perusia and Griva after heavy fighting, while Soviet engineers built temporary bridges across the Lovat under fire. However, the terrain quickly imposed its own logic. Tanks and trucks bogged down in the deep mud, and narrow forest paths became impassable. Communication between Soviet units broke down, and coordination between the 11th and 34th Armies faltered. German resistance was fierce and disciplined. By 20th September, Soviet forces had advanced to within 8 kilometers of Staraya Russa, threatening to encircle the German garrison. The 254th Rifle Division reached the outskirts of the town, but was halted by concentrated German artillery fire and counterattacks. On the southern flank, elements of the 11th Army briefly cut the Staraya Russa-Demansk road before being pushed back by the 30th Infantry Division and a detachment of German engineers. Civilians in the region endured catastrophic conditions. The constant shelling and bombing destroyed most of the villages between the Lovat and Polist rivers. Those who could fled eastward, while thousands were trapped in basements and forest shelters. German rear units requisitioned all available food supplies, while Soviet partisans began forming in the forests, conducting reconnaissance and attacking isolated German convoys. Food and ammunition shortages affected both sides. German soldiers built makeshift wooden walkways over flooded trenches, while Soviet troops dug shallow foxholes in waterlogged ground. Disease began to spread. Dysentery and trench foot afflicted thousands. By early October, the Soviet offensive had lost momentum. The Red Army had inflicted severe damage on German forces, but had failed to capture Staraya Russa or cut the 16th Army's supply lines. The Germans, though battered, retained control of their key defensive positions. Soviet casualties for September alone were estimated at over 30,000 killed, wounded, or missing, while German losses approached 10,000. The fighting revealed the limitations of both armies. The Soviets demonstrated determination and numerical strength. The primary supply road from Dino to Staraya Russa was impassable to motor traffic due to mud, and fuel shortages forced the army to abandon many vehicles. Horses replaced trucks in most transport columns, and units relied increasingly on local requisitioning for food and forage. The Soviets were in no better condition. The 34th and 11th Armies, commanded by Generals Kachanov and Morozov, had launched repeated attacks since mid-September, but their strength was waning. Rifle divisions had been reduced from 10,000 men to 3,000-4,000, and ammunition expenditure far outpaced resupply. Soviet artillery, initially formidable, now faced shortages of shells. Fuel for tanks was scarce, forcing many vehicles to be abandoned in the swamp. Nevertheless, Stavka ordered the offensive to continue, believing that persistence could still wear down the German defense and open a path toward Demansk. The casualties were enormous, and replacements were rushed forward with minimal training. Many new recruits lacked proper winter clothing or footwear, leading to frostbite and illness as temperatures dropped. Soviet field hospitals near Valdai overflowed with wounded, many evacuated by horse-drawn carts through the swamp. Yet despite the hardships, Red Army discipline remained firm. NKVD blocking detachments positioned behind frontline units ensured there would be no unauthorized retreats. Both sides sought to exploit the terrain to their advantage. German engineers constructed defensive belts of barbed wire, mines, and interlocking fire zones along the Lovat and Polist rivers. Observation posts were established on small patches of higher ground, allowing artillery to dominate the flooded plains. Soviet forces, in turn, relied increasingly on... The Germans still held Staraya Russa, but at the cost of thousands of men and the effective paralysis of their southern flank. The Soviets had failed to achieve a breakthrough, yet they had prevented the German advance toward the Valdai Hills and secured the approaches to Demansk. The battle had become a stalemate of endurance, setting the stage for the even harsher winter campaign that would soon engulf the entire northern front. By December 1941, the Battle of Staraya Russa reached its peak as the winter set in across northwestern Russia. What had begun as a muddy morass in autumn now turned into a frozen landscape of snow, ice, and bitter cold. Temperatures plunged below 30 degrees C, immobilizing vehicles, freezing weapons, and inflicting more casualties from frostbite than from combat. Yet despite the conditions, both armies continued to fight. The Red Army had overextended itself, and ammunition stocks were running low. Soldiers faced not only enemy fire, but exposure to the extreme cold, which froze weapons and rendered engines useless. Conditions for both armies were catastrophic. Frostbite cases numbered in the tens of thousands. German medical reports noted that by January 1942, more than 15% of frontline personnel were incapacitated by illness or cold injuries. Soviet losses were even higher. Entire rifle regiments were reduced to a few hundred men. Horses froze in their traces, and food shortages forced soldiers to eat frozen bread and unboiled rations. The bodies of fallen soldiers remained unburied, frozen into the ground until spring. Civilians still present in the combat zone endured unbearable suffering. Many villages were abandoned, their inhabitants dead or evacuated. Those remaining scavenged for both armies, battered by months of relentless combat and extreme weather, reorganized their forces to survive and continue fighting. The Germans clung to the defensive positions they had carved into the frozen landscape, while the Red Army learned from its earlier failures, refining its tactics and logistics for sustained operations in the Arctic-like conditions of the Northern Front. What followed was not a lull, but a transformation, from the chaos of maneuver warfare into a grueling war of endurance marked by entrenchment, improvisation, and attrition. The German 16th Army, commanded by General Ernst Busch, held a front line that stretched from Staraya Russa north to Lake Ilmen and south toward Demansk. Its divisions were exhausted, numbering barely half their authorized strength. The 30th, 126th, and 290th Infantry Divisions formed the core of the defense around Staraya Russa itself, supported by remnants of the 8th Panzer Division. The troops had adapted to static warfare, constructing an extensive network of trenches, dugouts, and strongpoints interconnected by communication tunnels. These fortifications were reinforced with timber and earth, designed to withstand artillery bombardment and freezing temperatures. German defensive doctrine evolved rapidly. Having learned that mechanized mobility was nearly impossible in the swamps and forests, commanders shifted focus to localized counterattacks, coordinated artillery fire, and the use of small mobile groups on skis or sleds. Engineers improved supply routes by building wooden corduroy roads and ice bridges over rivers, though these often collapsed under heavy loads. The Luftwaffe, despite limited fuel and aircraft availability, maintained vital air supply operations, dropping ammunition, food, and medical supplies into encircled positions when ground transport failed. Soviet adaptation was equally significant. These partisans, often composed of escaped soldiers and local civilians, forced the Germans to divert troops to rear area security, further weakening their frontline strength. Reports from the 16th Army in February 1942 recorded dozens of partisan raids each week, with supply losses mounting. The German response was harsh: anti-partisan sweeps, village burnings, and mass arrests, but could not fully suppress the growing movement. Conditions for the troops were appalling. Temperatures remained below freezing for months, with snow covering the ground until April. Soldiers on both sides faced constant hunger, disease, and frostbite. German rations were reduced to near starvation levels, while Soviet supply convoys struggled to reach the front through snowstorms. In many sectors, Soldiers scavenged for food in abandoned villages or relied on airdrops. Frostbite cases numbered in the tens of thousands. Soviet units celebrated small victories, recapturing a village, repelling a counterattack, or destroying a German convoy, as proof of eventual triumph. The harshness of the environment itself became a weapon. Soviet troops, better equipped and more accustomed to the cold, increasingly viewed winter as an ally. Adaptation extended beyond tactics to logistics. The Red Army's supply system, initially chaotic, improved as ice roads and sled convoys allowed steady delivery of ammunition and rations. Soviet engineers used captured German vehicles fitted with skis and treads to transport supplies over snow. Field workshops repaired weapons and tanks using improvised materials. In contrast, German logistics continued to deteriorate. The reliance on horse-drawn transport and captured Soviet vehicles proved insufficient, and fuel shortages left. The Germans clung desperately to their fortified perimeter, while the Soviets, though still numerically superior, faced exhaustion and dwindling supplies. What transformed the situation was not a single battle, but a strategic shift, one that linked Staraya Russa to the wider operations unfolding in northern Russia, particularly the Soviet attempt to encircle the German 16th Army and its neighboring formations near Demansk. The Demansk pocket, which formed in February 1942 when Soviet forces broke through south of Lake Ilmen, drastically altered the balance in the Staraya Russa sector. Several German divisions, among them the two 90th and 30th Infantry Divisions, were effectively trapped, their only lifeline being the small airfield at Demansk. Staraya Russa now became the main staging area for German relief efforts, its defenses transformed into a logistical anchor. Reinforcements from Army Group North, most notably elements of the 5th and 8th Panzer Divisions, were thrown into the effort to stabilize the front. General Walter von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt coordinated the relief operation from Staraya Russa, aiming to reopen a land corridor to the encircled forces in Demansk. On 21 March 1942, German spearheads began a coordinated advance from Staraya Russa southward, while troops inside the pocket struck north to meet them. After weeks of fighting through forests, rivers, and minefields, the two forces linked up on 21 April, creating a narrow, tenuous corridor only a few kilometers wide. The success of the relief operation marked the turning point of the battle. Although the Soviets retained control over most of the surrounding territory, the German 16th Army had avoided annihilation. The Luftwaffe's airlift had sustained over 100,000 men for more than 2 months, a feat that impressed even the German high command, and later influenced the decision to attempt a similar operation at Stalingrad. For the Soviets, the failure to destroy the pocket was a bitter setback. Despite suffering heavy losses, the Red Army had not achieved its objective of cutting off and eliminating the German forces around Staraya Russa. However, this success came at a steep cost for Germany. The relief of Demansk and the defense of Staraya Russa consumed immense resources and manpower. The 16th Army lost over 60,000 men in the winter campaign, and many of its divisions were reduced to skeletal strength. Equipment losses were irreplaceable, and the region's roads and supply routes were destroyed by constant shelling. The victory provided only temporary stability. Strategically, disease spread rapidly, with dysentery and typhus afflicting both armies. Civilians caught between the lines perished from hunger or exposure, their villages destroyed by artillery fire or deliberately burned during withdrawals. As the front stabilized by May 1942, it became evident that the Battle of Staraya Russa had reached a strategic impasse. The Germans held the town and the crucial corridor to Demansk, but their position was fragile. The Soviets controlled the surrounding forests and swamps, but lacked the strength for a decisive push. Both armies dug in once again, preparing for the next phase of the northern campaign. The turning point of Staraya Russa thus symbolized more than a single battle. It marked the end of mobility on this sector of the front. What had begun as a rapid offensive in 1941 had devolved into static trench warfare, where geography and endurance determined survival. For the soldiers on both sides, Staraya Russa was no longer just a name on a map, but a symbol of unending struggle, a place where entire divisions vanished into the mud, and where victory itself became indistinguishable from survival. By the summer of 1942, the fighting around Staraya Russa entered its final stage, defined by exhaustion, attrition, and a slow transition into defensive warfare. After nearly a year of combat, the swamps, forests, and ruins surrounding the town had become one of the most devastated landscapes on the Eastern Front. The German 16th Army, though still in control of Staraya Russa and the narrow land corridor to Demansk, was in no position to launch new offensives. The Red Army, meanwhile, continued its pressure with limited attacks, probing the German lines while preparing for future large-scale operations. The front, once envisioned as a staging ground for advances toward Leningrad or Moscow, had stagnated into a zone of unending hardship. Soviet artillery and partisans constantly targeted this route, destroying bridges and ambushing convoys. The Luftwaffe tried to compensate with air transport, but fuel shortages and Soviet fighter activity limited its effectiveness. The Wehrmacht's command structure also began to show strain, with frequent changes in leadership and disagreements between the 16th Army and Army Group North over resource allocation. For the Red Army, the prolonged fighting around Staraya Russa offered valuable lessons in coordination and endurance. Soviet engineers experimented with pontoon crossings and makeshift causeways to move supplies through the swamp. New units equipped with light mortars and submachine guns specialized in close-quarters combat within forests and villages. The presence of NKVD blocking detachments ensured that morale remained firm despite appalling losses. Soviet reconnaissance units also improved, infiltrating German rear areas to gather. The Germans retained control of the town, but at catastrophic cost. The Soviets had failed to achieve their operational objectives, yet they had tied down significant German forces and prevented their transfer to other fronts. The swampy battlefields around Staraya Russa symbolized the broader transformation of the Eastern Front, a war no longer defined by rapid movement but by grinding attrition, environmental hardship, and the sheer endurance of men and machines. The strategic outcome of the battle was a stalemate, but its human cost was immeasurable. Tens of thousands of soldiers from both sides remained buried, or simply lost, beneath the swamps and forests of northern Russia. The landscape itself became a monument to the futility of the campaign, frozen in winter, drowned in spring, and burning in summer. Staraya Russa had not fallen, but neither side could claim victory in a place where survival itself had become the only achievement. The 16th Army, which once served as the spearhead toward Leningrad, had been transformed into a static defensive force, its divisions understrength and worn down by endless combat. The Luftwaffe's costly airlift operations, hailed as a logistical triumph during the Demansk relief, had drained fuel, aircraft, and experienced crews that were desperately needed elsewhere. By 1943, the German High Command recognized that the position at Staraya Russa no longer had offensive value. It existed merely as a defensive bulwark, delaying the inevitable Soviet advance. For the Red Army, the battle represented both failure and evolution. The inability to destroy the German 16th Army in 1942 exposed persistent flaws in coordination, logistics, and communication. Yet it also demonstrated the growing resilience of Soviet forces. The Red Army that fought around Staraya Russa, it had learned to fight through impossible terrain, adapt to freezing winters, and sustain operations despite catastrophic losses. The Northwestern Front, though battered, gained invaluable experience that later contributed to more successful offensives in 1943 and 1944. The human toll was immense. Historians estimate combined casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, exceeded 200,000 on both sides during the 18 months of fighting. Thousands more perished from exposure, disease, and starvation. The battlefield itself became an open graveyard. When spring thaw returned each year, the receding snow revealed helmets, rifles, and bones protruding from the soil. Even decades later, Recovery teams continued to unearth remains in the swamps surrounding the town. For the civilians of the region, the consequences were equally catastrophic. Staraya Russa, once a provincial town of more than 25,000 inhabitants,